All right, hello, welcome back. So, it's August 25th today. The planet Venus is about to ingress into Leo, from which it will make an opposition to Pluto, and it will make a trine to Saturn and Neptune, which are both retrograding around the zero Aries point. So you've got a lot of action happening at the 0 point of the fixed signs and the trine that's making a trine to the cardinal sign of Aries, right? And the thing is, to be honest, I'm just using this as a loose starting point to launch off into another idea. And the main and I'm just thinking that it's good timing with this transit to approach this topic. It's a topic that has been on my mind for a while. And first of all, it's necessary for me to give a shout out to another astrologer producing astrology content out there called Collapse Astrology, and basically give props because I really like the way she uses this concept, Ayahuasca Fascism. However, at the same time, I have to admit that my approach to trying to one, produce my own astrology content, and two, socially interact with other astrologers is often I have been kind of put off by trying to interact with ideas that are in the astrology scene or whatever, because if there's somebody like I I could very well just get my ass blocked for taking somebody's idea and then trying to contribute to it, basically, right? Or trying to have a dialogue. In the past, there have been other astrologers where I have been talking about certain topics, and I've tried to leave a comment in the comment section, and I get blocked or whatever, right? So this has put me basically based on past experiences to just sort of stay in my own lane, and then not try to be not taking other people's ideas and criticizing them, because it's taken to be as you are kind of being hostile, or you're being something like, so. But I have to admit that part of this is that I have to affirm, first of all, that I do appreciate the idea that the term ayahuasca fascism is just something that is gaining mimetic value, for one thing. But then when I have to admit that my own perception, that maybe I personally have never done ayahuasca and I don't have any firsthand experience of it, so I don't feel like it's my place to speak on that directly. However, I have had plenty of experience with other people who have done ayahuasca, and then becomes this problem of am I using the word, if I'm thinking about this in terms of ayahuasca fascism, is it a trap to fall into by accusing people who do ayahuasca of immediately being fascists? Or like pointing out, then this is the problem about the word fascism, and is fascism overused, or is it actually, given the certain, a conversation about fascism in 2025 is a lot different than a conversation about fascism in, let's say, 2017 or if you go back further into the past. There was this problem where, do you just call everything you don't like fascism, or what does it mean exactly? How do you define it? And the main point is that I'm coming from it from a perspective of micro-fascism, which is to say that in the sense that we all basically carry around some kind of like internal manager, or an internal superego, or an internal policeman, and that maybe even if you apply developmental psychology or something like that, this could be based on our early childhood interactions with parents, and to the extent that our parents either model, the kind of behavior our parents model and how they parent us and control our behavior, from which we internalize that into a super ego or whatever. Like, there may be all kinds of, if you think about what fascism is, the Führer is like a father, right? The father figure. So you've got this like appeal to the strong parental super ego authority figure, that you are just weak, but you have to listen to what daddy says, this kind of stuff, right? And so like that kind of thing is that even if it's not completely explicit in the politics, then everybody, even the people who may identify as being anti-fascist, may be prone to their own forms of micro-fascism, basically, right? And so the point here is that not just that you could take from the position of recent events somebody like Elon Musk, who has been doing lots of ketamine and stuff like that, and doing Nazi salutes, and talking about the very real phenomenon of a rich class of elite who use ayahuasca and then get ideas for their business or whatever, but the psychedelic experience does not dissolve or transform their underlying fascism, but rather it brings it out, right? Now, the point that I'm trying to make is that I think there's a kind of psychedelic fascism that extends beyond just being ayahuasca fascism, especially if you notice that it seems like Elon Musk has been doing more like ketamine and LSD and mushrooms and stuff like that than actual ayahuasca, right? So there's a certain psychedelic fascism that goes beyond this. There's also the idea of Mark Fisher, before he died, was exploring this idea called acid communism. And so there's also this kind of idea of the return of the repressed, basically, so that like if you are in a social situation which has kind of made communism and Marxism into a kind of a black sheep or something that's scapegoated and outcast, then in that sense there's a kind of return of the repressed, right? There's the idea that the things that you can't, or censored out, that you can't talk about, become some sort of like ghost that's haunting, all these. It's also interesting if you apply this to early ghost stories, because I think we oftentimes tend to concretize ghosts into a very like, oh, they're just the spirits of people who are dead haunting, but there's also this whole kind of underlying repression force. And it's like the idea that if like the topic of fascism is something that's repressed, then the idea that if you do, the more psychedelics you do, and the more you open up what's in the shadow, then there's this possibility of the latent structure of the shadow that maybe somebody like Elon Musk or has latent repressed fascism that he has to repress for the sake of fitting into liberal society. But then the more he does LSD and ketamine and expands and opens up, then the repressed fascist structures just emerge out of the depths, basically, right? And the thing about this is, even if you apply this to people who in their livelihoods, in their professions, maybe occupying positions in society where they're not some elite class that's profiting off of all these people, but they're doing working class stuff or whatever, right? There are still micro-fascist characteristics to the psychedelic community, and especially I have one specific story in which I, of course, am not going to reference who these people are by name or something like that, but and hopefully it's not so obvious based on how small these communities are. But I was reminded about this because I was talking to a friend who I used to play music with, who, of all the friends that I keep in touch with, this guy seems to be, keeping touch with me over the years, and he was talking about things that he was getting into doing ayahuasca. He was getting into doing these what are they called, cacao ceremonies, right? Which reminded me about over 10 years ago, there was here in the small town that I live in, there was a community kind of place that did yoga, did cacao ceremonies, that did meditation ceremonies, and all this kind of stuff. And in that environment, I ended up finding a meditation teacher to work with who, in that setting of working with a meditation teacher, there was a certain, I think it was like the meditation teacher as well as what I was going through of kind of burning out on the whole festival party scene, that it was just seemed to reinforce the idea that the better path to take would be not to do ayahuasca, to stop doing psychedelic drugs and all that kind of stuff. And so in that context, I ended up going in this more of the direction being more of a very kind of sober and grounded kind of meditation practice rather. And then but the people that were doing the cacao ceremonies were really into doing ayahuasca and psychedelics and all this kind of stuff, and had a totally different kind of value system. And when I would like the guy who's doing the guy involved in the cacao ceremony was also doing a men's group. And what's kind of funny is that I ended up making friends with a guy. If you notice, I've got all this like. I ended up. Oh, hold on. Maybe if you just move over here, like I've got all these modular synthesizers. I ended up buying some of the stuff. If you notice this old Harvest Man, whatever. It's never mind. There's I ended up buying a bunch of like modular synthesizer stuff from one of the guys who was in this men's group. And he was a guy who had a mental health disability, who had just been going through a divorce and all this kind of stuff. And he, again, eventually, noticing this guy, I would recommend that if you have like a mental health disability for something like bipolar or schizophrenia, that personally I find it's like just makes more sense to avoid like psychedelics, LSD, magic mushrooms, ayahuasca, all that. But this guy, he's his own man. He's going to do his own stuff, right? So he's going to go to like men's groups put on by people who are all into ayahuasca. And then eventually this guy, it's not like it all happened all at once, but just based on witnessing other people, first of all, I think it sort of reinforces this idea for me of like there is a value in not trying to chase some sort of high or some sort of weird altered state through psychedelic drugs, and instead trying to take a very sober and grounded meditation practice instead. But like trying to like making efforts in that direction and then socializing in a community of people that put all this like positive value judgment on ayahuasca and all this kind of stuff sort of is like, it seems to be like there's like a disconnect that happens, right? Or there's a kind of like, and there's something about all this where am I thinking? The person the guy who was doing the men's group, the guy who was doing the cacao ceremony, the guy who was interested in doing ayahuasca and stuff like that, had an anecdote about how there is risks and dangers to ayahuasca, and that in this anecdote, him and a bunch of his friends went on some retreat somewhere to do some ayahuasca ceremonies and all this kind of stuff, and that there's something about the way, basically, why fascism is relevant to this. There's like, some people might have a mental health crisis, a breakdown, become hospitalized, become psychiatrized, being diagnosed as mentally ill, and all this kind of stuff. Whereas other people in the same drug, the same substance, the same circumstance, find this as a very like good thing for them, right? And it's like I don't mean to make any claim, because I'm just talking about this as observations from an outsider. But in this example, the guy who had a really hard time with the ayahuasca, who ended up being hospitalized, who ended up being diagnosed with mental illness, all this kind of stuff, was very queer, very gay, very kind of person who would be like not able to closet it. Like if you just never met the guy before and just introduce yourself, you're like, oh, this guy's obviously really gay, right? Like somebody who's just that like. And so in comparison, the other guy was much more. After doing all these ayahuasca trips, he was inspired to become a paramedic, firefighter kind of thing, and a guy who is much more macho in comparison, right? So I'm not saying that this is a pattern that I'm saying I have any insight into how ayahuasca works or what the pattern is, but I'm noticing a pattern that the people who seem to do better with ayahuasca trips tend to be these people who are more macho or or there's something about the latent structure of traditional masculinity, or like the person is, maybe what they're bringing into the ayahuasca trip is like they have a wounded relationship with their father, right? Or like there's because this the guy would in his men's group would talk about how he had this all these conflicts the guy had with his dad and his father image and all this kind of stuff, and you go into ayahuasca and to integrate that kind of stuff, and so the guy to be a big tough strong guy who's going to have a family and who's going to be a firefighter and all this kind of stuff, and then in contrast to that, the guy who's basically a queer is going crazy and is like in the hospital and is like it's like self-destruct mode for him, right? And so it's like what seems to happen is that there's some kind of underlying fascist structure which selects for the values of traditional masculinity and seems to deselect. Although the thing is, I am actually confused about this too, because I also notice there are certain people that are really into the psychedelic scene that are in fact might be gay, or that might be have all sorts of different things where they don't fit into these stereotypes of, but it's also kind of funny because there's something about like the idea of like social polarization and fragmentation where we start to like create these different tribes where you have all the the queer femme gay people over here, and you have all the well-to-do we're going to like be pro-natalist family people and work really hard, and we have the values of straight heteronormativity on one hand, and like, but in the actual circumstance these people are like friends and they're like going to the same parties and they're doing, it's like that the actual reality of the situation is that the stuff is all actually mixed up, right? And that there are, I don't know, sometimes I watch, for example, the Room Soup podcast, and that is an example of a guy who's really into doing all this ayahuasca stuff, but it doesn't seem to like make him spiral into the like self-judging homosexual. I don't even know if that was the reason why the guy had such a bad ayahuasca trip, but I'm just saying that from an outside perspective, it seems a lot to me that you're getting a bunch of people together to take a psychedelic substance that some people do really well with, some people really don't. And at least as an anecdote, it seems to conform to the biases of heteronormative patriarchal fascism, right? And that you can use ayahuasca to heal your wound to your patriarch and then become the strong man. And then if you're just a fag, you're going to be having a mental health breakdown and wanting to kill yourself because you're not going to be doing that, right? And you're hitting this hard wall of like, and especially in the social container where you have these really hard polarized dynamics, right? Where that's kind of and I think that if you take this further and then you go back to what happened with the hippies, there was this thing where take Ram Dass for example, where Ram Dass was a gay guy. First of all, he was a Jewish guy who was not able to, he had to go all the way to India and work with all these gurus and all this kind of stuff and give himself a whole different identity. So this idea of like becoming nobody of Ram Dass, you like Ram Dass, instead of healing this whole thing of healing the wound with his father and heal or whatever, it's like you have to just disassociate from your whole culture, from your whole family, alienate yourself from your family, run off to another culture, give yourself a new identity within a whole religious cult structure, then come back and then build that up again. And then it's sort of like, you know what I'm trying to say? There's like this thing where people do make it work for them, the psychedelic, like gay people getting into psychedelics and yoga, but you're dependent on some guru from exotic other place to be this idealized daddy figure, so that instead of you having to bother with fitting into this patriarchal, you know what I'm, so, but this becomes a sort of all-inclusive, no boundary, East and West, like global multiculturalism thing. And then, Ram Dass would be famous for saying like, people if you criticize me for being a gay Jewish guy who devotes himself to a Hindu guru while also doing Buddhist meditation and just there's like coloring outside all the lines. Like, we're in this moment right now where I just sense that style of spirituality has gone out of favor, and what you see as being trendy is this movement towards a reaffirmation of all these traditional things, or like the golden age of to reassert our family values that have been, and it's like, I find that the more there's something about the idea of like not just ayahuasca but psychedelics in general, and the idea of like cults or whatever, right? And like even stuff like Charles Manson, like there's obviously even Charles Manson drew a fucking swastika on his head, right? And the idea that there you could easily swing from peace and love hippies into crazy fascist cults, and because people are you if you use a lot of psychedelics to let go of your personal identity and then you just fall into in-group belonging, you could either do that with the culture you find yourself in, or the tradition, you heal your relation to the tradition where you come from, or else you could fall in with whatever commune of hippies or whatever, and then in that structure you just there it's something where it's like you let go of your personality and just fall into the group dynamic. But there's an inherent risk with that. That's basically like Fight Club, right? Like in Fight Club, they have this whole thing where, to let go of being a special individual snowflake and you shave your head and become another one of the space monkeys, right? And so like, I think Fight Club for our generation, I know a lot of people give it a lot of criticism or give it a lot of flack these days, but Fight Club is like, an example or kind of meant to be kind of a warning of this pattern, because it starts off with a guy doing all these sort of like visualization things where you go in the cave and meet the archetype and all this kind of stuff, and then he gets radicalized into being a fascist extremist cult or gang or whatever, right? Like this is basically, I'm just trying to say that if you take the like Fight Club and you take all this other kind of stuff, there's so many different ways that something like ayahuasca fascism or psychedelic fascism can play out that isn't just being a guy who is from the wealthy elite who previously to fit in had to conform to a certain standard of the liberal majority, and now that is breaking down socially, and you have just free access to all the ketamine and drugs that you want, that your former modes of repression are just giving way and you're just spontaneously doing like Nazi salutes. Like that's kind of like, it is relevant to that, but I'm recording this basically to sort of describe all these other forms of ayahuasca fascism or psychedelic fascism that seem to basically exist to a kind of erode down the ego structure, right? So that you then basically harmonize with whatever group dynamic that you're in, right? And that it could just, if you are just eroding down your personality to harmonize with the group dynamic that's around you, then that could be whatever latent structures that are beneath the veneer. Like this is the whole red pill, blue pill thing, right? Is that the blue pill is something like we have to be polite and sort of like, or like the idea of an artificial politeness versus there's some kind of hidden, secret fascist structure lurking beneath, right? And that you in your normal day-to-day life, you have to produce this fictional ego that allows you to get along with all your neighbors and to live a civilized, polite society. But then if you do enough ayahuasca and ketamine and LSD, then your inner Nazi lurking in the surface begins to, oh no, wait a minute, what if I'm just doing this because I'm there's some underlying power dynamic that's been buried beneath all of this, right? And so to bring it back, I'm not just doing a video on ayahuasca fascism, but Venus and Pluto, is that part of the Venus archetype that I've noticed is that there's something about the way that women are conditioned versus the way that men are conditioned, and that there's something about, even if a woman is feminist or or believes in progressive values, that women tend to have a personality probably just based on cultural conditioning, where it's like being let's say a waitress or something, right? Or a hostess, right? Like where you have to, regardless of whether or not you actually like people, you have to have a very agreeable, friendly personality. Like you're a waitress, or like, can I take your order, and all this kind of stuff. And there's something that's kind of also, if you think about maybe another direction to go with this, is like people who mistake professional friendliness for somebody being like coming onto them, because like, you've got all these lonely dudes out there, or like, oh, somebody was nice to me, maybe I can ask them out on a date, and then the women are like, yeah, that's my job, I get paid. If I'm not nice to you, I get fired. If I'm not nice to you, I don't get tips. If I'm not nice to you, you know what I'm trying to say? Like I'm actually have to be nice to you, and then you thinking that's a come on is just you being like a prick or whatever, right? So there's this whole point where women are really conditioned to be this way, whereas men are conditioned to be a different, like men are conditioned to be Marsy in the sense of being like, you know, more so there's basically in so like the Venus is there to like smooth things over, to make everything kind of nice, but it's like there's this question of the repression and authenticity, basically, right? Is that our like the blue pill, red pill dynamic, which I whatever, I'm into. I've been sucked into it now. I tend to want to avoid it because it comes also from the whole incel community, and I think that it's maybe just I have this kind of idea that if you appropriate language from a certain community, you are somehow validating that language as something that's somehow worthy to implement and worthy to use, right? And I think that a lot of that there's a I don't really want to affirm that way of looking at things, but it seems to have asserted itself somehow in this dominant way in the culture right now. But I think a lot of it has to do with the keeping up the veneer of politeness, civilized, cooperative, friendliness versus some kind of hidden latent repression or hidden latent aggression or something like that, or power dynamic which shapes things to be this way. And it reminds me of like, I just remembering this one, I met this person when I was living on Vancouver Island, and there's something, it's coming up for me because it seems like a good example of this, is that this one person could play guitar and was actually a fairly talented guitar player, but she had a very specific style of lots of finger picking and being very like intricate and sophisticated, I would say, but in a way where it's like trying to, like, you're playing in a way that is like soft, that's not very loud, but you're gonna get all the finger picking right, not making any mistakes, but it's in a way that doesn't come across as like, it's like as if you were to hit if you're gonna do everything so perfect in a way that if you hit a bad note, oh God, sorry, did I play the wrong note? Oh, sorry. Am I playing too loudly? Oh, sorry. Would you like it if I changed the style to a different? Like it's like this kind of. Whereas the way a guy would play a guitar instead would be like Marshall stack, guitar pedal, power chord. It's like, and it's like, it's not like they're just to be like fucking like Sun O and just fucking like it's like there's something about like the personality of being like, I'm going to just like crank my amplifier up so loud the whole neighborhood can hear it, put a whole like reverb, delay, guitar pedals, and just like do a doom sludge thing, versus being a very like I'm sorry, would you like me to play a different kind of song for you? And like, what would you like me to play for? Thank you. Okay. And like, it's like you're so conditioned into this kind of like personality that it's like you're doing it because there's a power dynamic around it, right? It's not because this is kind of the thing about that you could say that you're like, well, it is, yeah, I'm authentic because I've developed this personality because it's useful for being employed, right? It's useful for customer service, for dealing with people and all this kind of stuff. And because it's authentic, because if I didn't have this personality, I wouldn't be able to survive, right? I need to develop. So, but a man is like, if a man displays those characteristics, it's judged to be effeminate, is judged to be something that is going to put him at a vulnerability, right? It's gonna like the more that you're women are supposed to be like that. You're supposed to be the strong man who, if something's wrong, hey, yo, what's up? Yo, hey, you're like, a man's is supposed to be like, you're not apologizing for everything. You're just snapping your fingers and everybody, oh, he's here. We got to do it. We got to do what daddy says. We got to do what the boss says, right? You're not like smoothing over everything. Like, oh, can I help you? Can I take your order? Oh my God. Like, it's like, so there's this kind of like, there's like these latent structures which like you could be a progressive liberal feminist and believe in like all non-binary gender expression and all, but you could still just be completely conditioned by some underlying power dynamic that you don't have any ability to question or talk about or even acknowledge. And then there's somebody else could be like could see through that and then just be like, oh, like what matters isn't this veneer, it's this underlying power dynamic, and that I just have to like, I've spent so much of my life just being conditioned by this whole system, right? That like, if the more you do psychedelics, the more you just sort of see through things. Things become more transparent, and you're not taking it at face value. Instead, you're saying there's an underlying power dynamic underneath it, right? And so to bring it back to the Venus-Pluto thing, I think that the obvious thing is that there's some kind of necessity to smooth things over, right? But so often that this dynamic of smoothing things over, like covering up the underlying power dynamic, is actually being complicit with oppressive systems, right? Or being complicit with forces of exploitation, or being complicit with forces of all sorts of things, right? Because it's like you're not questioning what it is you're covering up for. But there's all like, I think a great example of this recently has been the Netflix. Or I don't know. I have to just firstly admit that I have never read Neil Gaiman's Sandman, but I watched the Netflix first season, and it seems to me like there's this mad rush to basically make as much money off of Neil Gaiman as possible before all his like MeToo cancel culture indiscretions have ruined his name in the marketplace, right? So I watched this show before Neil Gaiman was out that he's like has done some bad things with women, and that he's basically not respected anymore or whatever, right? But there's something about there's this one episode in it that I keep thinking about where it's like they're in a diner, and it's like this whole thing about the necessity of like creating this illusion, this fantasy, so that you don't see the real power dynamics underneath it. And then it's like it seems in the context where the person who's writing that story, who's arguing for the necessity of having this sort of social veneer, this kind of artificial fantasy to not do the, well, I mean, if you're the person who's being exploiting women through the power dynamic, of course you want to have the veneer that makes everything seem nicer than it is, right? And of course you would portray it that if we just let all the power dynamics be exposed, it would be like chaos, the end of the world, and everybody would be, it would be like riots on the streets, and everybody, like, it's like, because you're the person who's complicit within all this stuff. And so from that perspective, it obviously makes sense, right? But at the same time, there's also, I think it's also funny because there's some kind of like, Slavoj Žižek is also like this too, right? The idea that like Slavoj Žižek criticizes the idea of an authentic self as opposed to the false ego, because so often it's like the authentic self is just something that's repressed out of what we have to do to make everything work. This is also, Gurdjieff has a similar criticism of authenticity. Gurdjieff criticizes turning authenticity into just whatever it is that's repressed, right? That like, because there could be any number of situations where the appropriate behavior in a given, like astrology is kind of similar to this too, right? Like a planet, like a sign represents a certain environment, and that a planet either has a easy time in that environment, or it has a difficult time in that environment, right? And depending on its nature, right? So more like Venus. Okay, this is maybe a bit complicated because in the sense that Venus in Leo doesn't really necessarily is peregrine. It doesn't necessarily have good dignity or bad dignity in Leo because it's the sign of the sun, right? But in that environment, Venus will find ways to express herself that works with that environment, right? And that the authenticity if there's something that's repressed, it was just whatever is repressed is just what would work better in a different environment. And it's not really like, it's not that it's inauthentic to do what is necessary or what is good for the environment or the situation that we're in, but there's this kind of funny dynamic where because the more that you're locked into just trying to smooth over and harmonize everything in that environment without being able to criticize or judge or question anything, then there's this problem about it because you get the sense that the actual situation that we're dealing with is something that we can only adapt ourselves to, but we don't have any creative control or authority over, right? And I think that the sun and Leo in its highest stands for this sort of agential force, right? And I think what's interesting about feminism too is that a lot of the principles of progressive feminism is trying to give women back this kind of agency where they get to make their own choices, have control over their own lives, and it's not just up to them trying to harmonize into an environment where the man is the boss, the man is the patriarch, the man is at the lead, right? So there's this kind of thing is like to give everybody their own agency so you're not just stuck harmonizing in something you don't have any choice over or that you don't have any control over, right? But this has also it's created this whole situation where, again, bringing it back to the beginning, is that my personality is I've worked jobs with customer service, and I get it, where you put on a uniform and you do this artificial customer service thing for the sake of making money. And the thing is, it's like, I think you can think about it as having like enough gas in the gas tank. I have a certain amount of energy to do that, but eventually it burns itself out, and I have more. What I find interesting about Pluto and the idea of the depths, the unconscious, or whatever, is that, or there's something about the idea of something like psychoanalysis or talk therapy, is that it gives you an opportunity to talk about things that normally, it's like imagine, like, compare it to playing a game, right? Like Monopoly or poker or whatever it is, right? You could have if you're playing poker, are aces high or aces low, right? Are jokers wild? You have all these parameters to the game that you're playing, but when you're in the game, you accept the rules and you just play it based on it. And then it's like as if, like, what's great about things like psychoanalysis or therapy or something like that is that you have an opportunity to step outside of this game that you're always so involved in, and then you have an opportunity to take a meta-analytical view of this game that you're in and looking at the rules of and seeing how much of this is really just fixed and necessary versus how much of this is something that we can transform and change to realign with what we know in our hearts to be the truth of things, right? That to some extent, when our efforts in this Venusian way to smooth over and gloss over all these problems to create this friendly, atmosphere that business can carry on smoothly and efficiently. If this whole effort is in itself complicit with forms of exploitation and oppression and all kinds of bad stuff lurking under the surface, then at least do we have spaces where we can separate ourselves from playing these stupid games and being able to, like, take a more wide boundary view of the situation, zooming out, and to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, we could actually make the world or we can make this whole dynamic better by seeing that certain of these rules or certain of these structures are contingent. You know, that it doesn't have to be this way. We could easily do things a different way, right? And so I think that there's some kind of other part of this. There's some sort of hidden gold in it, and that, so, like, at some level we all know that there's something phony about the way that the world is, and that we could rewrite the rules, we could change the game, we could imagine a different way of doing things, right? But the more we're just content to just harmonize or to smooth over or to make peace with things as they are, we lose this transformative potential to see how we can change and transform things, right? But that like, so there's some kind of like, I think there is some sort of like, I think that's oftentimes the fascists are frustrated with things, the way things are. They want to take a heroic move to redefine the situation, but then that just becomes another form of oppression, of destroying things and trying to force your will to make things what you think it should be, right? And so in that, to avoid that, it's necessary to take a non-totalitarian approach where you're not just creating one singular daddy figure to be the one who dictates the way everything should be, because it's not really that's just falling back on the latent structure of our history of empire and kings and feudalism and all this kind of stuff. Okay, all right. Thanks for watching. This was my idea for today. Have a good one. Please like and subscribe. And if you have anyone who wants a reading, I do natal chart readings. Thank you very much.